This is my brother's entrance hall. It's a pretty tight space, so places to store shoes, coats and bags has always been difficult to find, so we wanted to see if we could make use of this space underneath the stairs. First, I'm going to drill an inspection hole so that we can see what's inside. I have a 100mm core drill bit, which has always done a great job at cutting through concrete blocks. However, it was no match for the blocks inside this wall. Sparks were flying everywhere. This block was really tough. It felt like we were getting nowhere, so a change of approach was needed, so I started stitch drilling a series of holes with an ordinary masonry bit instead. And that cleared enough of the waste to allow the core drill to finally cut through. After doing a bit of research, I think this is called clinker block. It was pretty common in the 1930s when this house was built, and it's made up of waste material from coal-fired power stations. I can then have a look inside, and there's a fair amount of space on the left here. But on the right, we are almost hard up against another block wall, which is the back wall of this pantry. Just by the way, generally staircases like these are self-supporting. All of the strength comes from the stringers, meaning that the wall underneath is non-structural. But before embarking on a project like this one, it could be worth consulting with a structural engineer or a good builder. I don't know if you noticed all those blocks of wood on the floor. Those are glue blocks and they're meant to be secured where each tread meets the riser. They must have just come loose and fallen away over the years, but we will get those secured again later. Before we do any cutting, we masked off the area as best we could with dust sheets. This is going to create one hell of a mess, so anything we can do to limit that should save us a lot of clearing up later. I was planning on using a laser line to cut to, but there wasn't really enough space, so I ended up marking a pencil line. I don't need my cuts to be perfectly straight anyway, but I do want the cuts to be as plumb as possible. We really should have got another dust sheet to put over the carpet, but stupidly we didn't. We did seal up all of the doors in the hallway though, so at least all the dust would be confined to this small space. I'm using my angle grinder with a 230mm diamond blade. This has a depth of cut big enough to cut through these 62mm thick walls, consisting of 12mm plasterboard and 50mm block. As you can see, things got very dusty very quickly, and we set the smoke alarm off. I set up a fan to blow the dust outside, but I don't think it helped much. What did help though was using my leaf blower to clear as much of the dust as possible. A bit more stitch drilling needed to clear the waste in each corner where the blade couldn't reach. And then we can finally remove the blocks. And also the old skirting board. I was planning to frame out the opening with timber to help support the blocks up here, but unfortunately we encountered a problem. We noticed a hairline crack on the mortar line between two blocks, which made the wall on the left here a little bit unstable. So we came to a decision that we'd be better off removing the rest of the wall entirely and rebuilding it later. So that's what we're going to do, but rather than do more cutting and make more mess, I'll use a bolster instead just to remove this last little bit. A couple of years ago at a garden sale, I picked up these large terrazzo style tiles, but I've never really known what to do with them until now. Once the concrete floor was cleaned up and free of dust, I started to apply some of this product called Primer G. I think it's similar to SBR, which is basically going to reduce the suction from the concrete so that it doesn't suck all the moisture out of the tile adhesive that I'm going to be using.
What are you doing, Casey?
I'm priming.
Why?
Because it'll help the tiles stick down better.
Why?
Because tiles go on the floor.
Why?
Because that's where they live.
Why?
I just get it brushed on and then I set up a fan just to speed up the drying time, and it was dry within 20 minutes. The tiles are 800mm square, so I'm measuring in about 820mm here to account for the fact that we're going to be putting some 12mm plasterboard on this wall later, I also want a few millimeters for grout lines between the tiles. And from there I can work out what cuts I need to make to get the second tile to fill the rest of the space. I'm using a diamond blade again to cut the tile, and then I can start mixing up some tile adhesive. Because these tiles are so big but the space we're working in is so small, it's going to be tricky to get the tiles positioned correctly. It would have been much easier to use smaller tiles, but we'll get them in there one way or another. I back buttered each of the tiles too to make sure I get good adhesion. I needed help getting the second one in. And after a bit of jiggery-pokery, it fitted nice with a 3mm grout line in between. I allowed a bit of time for the adhesive to go off. It sets within 3 to 4 hours, but I didn't have that much time to hang around, so I was wanting to get it grouted after about an hour or so, and it seemed plenty firm enough by then for me to get on with it. I get any mess cleaned up with a sponge, but it has to be a pink sponge, otherwise it won't work properly. Back at my workshop now, and I need to build some kind of storage solution that will make the most of the space underneath the stairs. So I grabbed some 18mm MDF, and with all the necessary measurements in hand, I first started marking out and cutting 2 side panels. Then I grabbed some pieces of 24mm MDF to cut some shelves. I'm using thicker MDF for this because these shelves are going to be spanning just over 800mm with no support, and I don't want them to sag. I get the front edges rounded over, and I can start priming everything. For MDF edges, it's really important to denib thoroughly after priming to get good coverage with paint and get everything perfectly smooth. There's really no need for MDF sealer products in my opinion. With a couple of spacers underneath, I can get the first shelf fitted, and I'm just using glue and screws because the side panels here will never be seen. Having said that, I did fill the screw heads anyway. And I'm using satin wood white paint as a top coat, which will be nice and durable. Back at my brother's now, and unfortunately the shelves I built wouldn't quite fit in between the 2 stringers. It was 1 millimeter or 2 wider than it should have been. It was an easy fix though. I just made a diagonal cut on one side so that it fits under the stringer instead. I can then get it positioned and determine how big I want my new opening to be so that I can start framing the wall. I'm using a 3x2 for this, or 63x38mm CLS timber, and I'll get a base plate cut first. I fitted the base plate using concrete screws straight into the concrete beneath, and then I can just measure up for each upright. While I was back at the workshop, I also prepared some other bits and bobs, including using some salvaged pine to make some door linings, some 18mm MDF to make a door, also this piece of 6mm MDF to clad the wall framing. I also had some of these push to open door catches. I bought these back when I made my pop-up bench dogs. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the description. Unfortunately though, I didn't have any holders for them, so I'm going to make my own. And I had some spare bits of bullnose architrave up here, which we can use around the door. The final piece I made at the workshop was this 24mm MDF threshold that I'm about to fit. And fitting this before the door lining turned out to be a mistake. I'll show why a little bit later in the video. Then I can get the door linings in.
Type it all in a spreadsheet.
Before I hang the door, we got a piece of plasterboard that we can use to cover the block wall. Plasterboard is usually fitted using either plasterboard adhesive, or what I've used in the past is the spray foam stuff. But going out to buy some just for this one piece of plasterboard seemed like a waste of time and money, and as we had half a bag of tile adhesive left over, I mixed some of that up to quite a thick consistency, and we're going to give this a go instead. It certainly seemed to be sticking pretty well, and without too much slumping too, so we went for it. And it seemed to work pretty well, although I did add one screw at the top of the wall off camera just because it needed pulling in a bit at the top. It was a bit too dark and awkward to film inside there. I was also running out of time on this particular day, so I'm starting to rush a little bit.
I am a champion. Never hear me roar.
The door was cut oversized, so I can make a couple of cuts to get it to fit. Oh, and don't worry about that big gap at the top just yet. I can then nibble away the skirting board ready to fit the architrave. And here's where I realised it was a mistake to fit the threshold before the lining and architrave. You can see here that I had to cut a little notch out, but hopefully once this is caulked and painted, it should look okay. And I'm marking up the bisected angle here so that they meet together nicely. I don't need to know what the angle is, I can just work to my pencil marks and cut accordingly. And once all these pieces are in, I can caulk the gaps. So sorry that those last bits of footage were a bit rushed, but I ran out of time and my brother was happy to finish up the remaining bits of decorating, so let's take a look at the finished job.